Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to everyone to another Project Ihya podcast. We thank everyone for being here. Alhamdulillah, we have an esteemed guest who's going to be with us today and present to us an informative, inshallah, discussion around what is some regarding something which is absolutely pertinent and which has been in front of our eyes at least for the last 3 weeks. Everybody knows and is well aware of what's happening right now in Palestine, in Gaza. And a lot of questions are coming up in a lot of people's minds, a lot of hard questions. We hear and we see on the news, on the media, a lot of narratives are presented which clash or which go against sometimes our own internal what we feel and what we know to be true. So it's important that we go back and we review the facts and the history about Palestine and what is actually going on there. From historical, going back a little bit in history and how we got to the current point that we are in, and how we can view these narratives a little more objectively and look at things with a little bit more well informed, I guess I can say. So, inshallah, for that, we have a guest here with us, Dr. Yakub Ahmed. Inshallah, I'm going to allow Hafiz Musab to, inshallah, introduce our guest. And inshallah, Dr. Yakub will be presenting a presentation that he's prepared on the history of Palestine and this situation that everyone is witness to, at least aware of these days.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Yakub Ahmed, and mashallah, I met Dr. Yakub in Chicago where he did a fabulous presentation on the role of ulama in the Ottoman Empire. So he's a well-known historian, like in the da'wah scene, mashallah, online, and also he does many programs and classes, and he's based out of Istanbul in Turkey. So Dr. Yakub, he's currently an assistant professor at Istanbul University's Islamic Studies Institute, where he's a full-time researcher. And he also teaches Islamic history at the Ilahiyat department at the same university. And he's a PhD graduate from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. And he also specializes in late Ottoman history, the history of nationalism, and the Turkish Republic. He's been a regular member of podcasts such as the Ottoman History Podcast and the Thinking Muslim Podcast. And he's also written articles for TRT World and Middle East Eye. So his PhD, the focus of his PhD was on the Ottoman ulama. So mashallah, he's a historian, and he's the right person to talk to us about the modern history of Gaza, of Palestine, especially because it was directly under the rule of the Ottomans before it was the Jewish state was so-called Jewish state was established on it. So inshallah, without any further ado, I will hand it over to our esteemed guest to start his presentation.
And I would also just encourage everyone, inshallah, to like, subscribe, and leave a comment also, inshallah, to the podcast, inshallah, for your benefit and inshallah for other people as well. Jazakumullah.
Thank you very much. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. I feel in these times it's always important to start with the words of Allah Ta'ala. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْهُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ تَوَّابًا. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. May Allah Ta'ala make it easy for us in these testing times. When I was asked to do this presentation, I mean, being an Ottoman historian, this is a subject that comes up a lot right now. What I found in this particular period of disinformation, alhamdulillah, a lot of people want to now know what the truth is. I'm going to first posit this for your viewers, just a disclaimer that whenever somebody tells you something and asks you to prove something with a point or a question, I'm going to stress for you guys right now is that before trying to find the answer to that question, to scrutinize the questioner, to scrutinize the validity of the position that they're holding, to scrutinize the evidence that's based behind the position that they're holding. So whatever someone says to you as a Muslim or as somebody from the region or whatnot, that, prove to me that this happened because you did ABC. They say, we did ABC. What's your evidence? How are you making this claim? From what perspective have you had the audacity and the authority to hold this position? Let me see your evidence first, for you're the one who's making this position. It's important that not only do we have a position where we show evidence, but that we also scrutinize the evidence on the other side and not allow them to get away with the lies. Because this is exactly what's happening. And what happens is that we get caught up in a trap of lies where continuously we're in this vicious cycle. And by the time we try to prove one point, the goalposts have been moved. And then we try to prove that point and the goalposts have been moved. And we get caught up in this situation. So whenever you're in a public debate, a private debate, you're talking to somebody who says A, B, C, D about the Muslims, about this situation or whatsoever, you say, how are you holding that position? What's your evidence? So that you can see what framework they're using and what perspective they're coming from, and to see the validity of the position. And most of the times, you'll see that the positions they're holding are just smokescreens, or they're just Orientalist positions, or they're old positions that have no evidence whatsoever. An example, before I start my talk, the 40 babies being beheaded. They ran with that. And what the interesting thing is we should have pressed them. What's your evidence? Where's the proof? Where's it coming from? And this is just the current sort of hasbara machinery that's taking place, which is crippling in front of our eyes, alhamdulillah, because of the will of Allah Ta'ala. This is something that we see consistently in our politics, in the way that they double speak, in the journalism and in the academic world. It's consistent. And so one of the things I want you to do now is whenever you look at a form of information, before feeling a sense of defensiveness, in the need to defend yourself, but then coming to somebody like myself and say, can you prove this? You say to that person first, wait, hang on a minute. The onus is not on me first. The onus is on you to lay down your position. Let me see it. And then I'll go to the drawing board. And a lot of times you'll see they'll crumble. They'll literally crumble because it's based on a pack of lies. So I just wanted to make that disclaimer out there so that everybody knows that, inshallah.
I think that was an incredibly important point, because a lot of times we end up attempting to answer questions where we don't accept the premise ourselves.
Right.
But now we're answering the question. It's almost like we've internally accepted the premise, and now we're trying to answer it. Like you mentioned, the 40 babies, they'll ask us, do you support 40 babies? Now, the beheading of 40 babies. Now, if we answer that question, it's like we've already accepted that it's happened.
Right. Exactly.
Instead of asking, sometimes we can't answer questions where we disagree on the premise of the question. So I think that's an incredibly important point. And hopefully, inshallah, the information we glean from today's presentation will help us think more critically about, the way questions are formulated around false assumptions and presuppositions that they kind of, tacitly put into our minds when we start these kind of discussions.
And not only that, I mean, look, I'll give you an example. When they continuously, like a dog on a bone, insist on the issue of do you condemn Hamas, what they're actually doing is they're questioning your humanity. Mm-hmm. They're trying to see from their framework, from their framework, they're trying to say, I'm a human, I have humanity, but do you have humanity? And I've set this framework of what the framework of being human means. And now I'm going to test you on it, because you know what? Inherently in the question is an assumption that you are not worthy or not equal to my humanity, and I need to test it first. So let me see what your answer is before we can have this conversation. But at no moment, at no time, if you flip the question and say, wait, let me ask you a question. Do you condone the killing of innocent babies? Straight away, they'll say, let me give you context. There has to be context in the subject area. And as a historian, I've been raised on the need to give context, right? But I've also been raised in understanding that questions are not simply designed to get an answer from you. They are laden with a particular sense of value. There's a value in it. Understand the question, or we as Muslims need to learn that when we are being asked these questions, what is the root behind it? What is the objective behind it? And initially, when they start with this first question about the condemnation, they're not interested in the issue of Hamas or non-Hamas. What they're interested in is trying to see from their civilizational framework whether you are worthy to be equitable or equivalent to my civilization in that sense, right? They've already looked down on you. And then saying to elevate yourself from your position to be an equal partner to me, you first have to hold this position.
So if I may, sorry to cut you off, I didn't mean to. Could I ask a question? So sometimes,
Sure.
a lot of times when a question like this is posed,
Yeah.
and we attempt to say that, listen, let me try to put some context around the question.
Yeah.
They frame that sort of answer as you are unable to answer the question, and therefore you're evading the question by talking about other things. So, as a strategy, should we engage with context? For example, let's take the example of, do you condemn Hamas? So should we go towards, so like there could basically be two strategies here. One is to talk about, well, let's contextualize what's happening. And the other one is to question the question itself, which is to say that, well, is this even about Hamas, or is this something which the, narrative in the government and the people and just about all the people that are running the show right now in the sort of in the Zionist state, they've all said it clearly, and they've shown clearly that their objective isn't really Hamas. It's something bigger than that.
Right.
It's something more than that. So should we jump? Should the strategy be to try to contextualize the question because they can misuse that, or should it be to question the question, which then I guess they could also say the same thing and say you're just avoiding our question.
My personal position is I just reject the question. I say it's a bogus question. It's a trap question. It's bogus. I reject it. I'm not answering it. And they can go on and on about why you're not answering it. I reject to answer it because I don't have to. That's a trap question, because inherently there's a value you've put in that question of testing my humanity, and I reject that. I reject your imposition on me, and I reject your assumption of me. So I reject the question outright. I'm not starting from this question. I reject it. Now, if you want to start from this question, we're not having this conversation. If you want to know what's happening, because what you need to do, I guess, to some degree, is we have to realize that if you give away your agency in the rules of engagement, then you're finished. Then you've got no chance. So what you need to do, to some degree, is wrestle that back. Now, it's very possible that if you're on a TV show or talk show or whatnot, they're not going to give you that. Then you have to opt to say, you know what, then I'm not interested. But if you're going to be speaking in your private spaces, in coffee shops, in book clubs, and universities and so forth, you have to dismantle the space from which this question is coming from, because there's no way of winning this if you realize that if I give it context, they're not interested. And if I try to go and try to answer this question in a way which I think is feasible, they're still not interested, because what they want is literally the answer that they want. That's all they're interested in. Because what are they testing here? Like I said, they're testing your humanity. The question is irrelevant to them. Right. They're actually testing whether you're worthy to be here or not. And in that sense, once again, I say this, that we have to decenter. We have to decenter the West. We have to decenter its language, and we have to decenter its frameworks. Part of the boycott movement, and people, have different opinions on it, but I'm in support of the boycott movement, because we should decenter from being dependent on this Westphalian culture of Starbucks, McDonald's, and so forth. Instead, what we should be doing is supporting local Muslim businesses, encouraging Muslim clothing, encouraging Muslims to circulate money amongst themselves. And this is an opportune moment where you can move away from the large corporate that have us in their pocket and think they can take us for granted, and say, enough of this. We're not going to live like this. We've got indigenous foods, we've got indigenous cultures, we've got indigenous forms of clothing. And you know what? We're going to do business predominantly amongst ourselves. And this is why I support the boycott movement. It's not simply the issue of trying to hurt Starbucks. It's the issue of waking up Muslims by saying, hey, we don't need to be caught up in this particular culture, which is going down a rabbit hole and destroying itself and taking us with it. And this is, alhamdulillah, an opportunity where, just like Jibreel alayhi salam was shaking Rasul sallam when he was asking him to recite the Quran, that Allah Ta'ala is shaking us right now and saying, you got a chance, Yani. So this is why I see it in this sense, that when I say to decenter the West, what do I mean? To return to La ilaha illallah. When Adam alayhi salam gave his shahada to Allah Ta'ala, he said, Allah Ta'ala is al-haq, and Allah Ta'ala is the only reality. There was nothing but Allah Ta'ala. And this is why I keep telling Muslims that now move away from centering this dunya as your life and allowing the West to lead this dunya in the way that we exist as human beings, and come back to Islam. Come back to Islam, Yani,
Yeah, that's an important point, because this narrative is sort of couched within this larger cultural, I guess you can say, war. Right. So in order to counter the narrative, you'd have to counter also the effects of the larger cultural cushioning around it. So inshallah, I guess on that note, we could even jump in probably towards the...
and then just one last point, in terms of the presentation, and this is the point I'm making, which is today you're going to see that it's all couched in a particular colonial framework. And It's not just about liberating Palestine from the colonial framework of the Zionists. We all have to liberate ourselves from the emotional and intellectual colonial frameworks that are still holding us down. Yani. This is the thing. We are all contaminated by the colonialism. We need to now shake it. And I think this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, actually, our last podcast was on that particular topic. We talked about colonialism and breaking away
Cognitive colonialism.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
So,
Okay.
inshallah, Mus'ab, inshallah, if you could, yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So, what is in a name, right? And I started with this whole idea of why is the name Palestine important? And one of the things that you see is that naming something or giving something a name gives you a sense of existence. If you don't have a name, you literally don't exist. And so whether Muslims will have been asking me at the time, but Palestine, why is it not an Islamic name and so forth? And I say, look, that's irrelevant. What's relevant is that the people at the time who were living there, the area for a very long time has had a name called Palestine, and the people that are living there are trying to identify the place. Just like if I asked you where you're from, I'd say I'm from London, I'm from Chicago, I'm from New York. You couldn't say I'm from nothing. It makes zero sense. And so the indication is, and the argument is that what the Israelis have done, and we're going to see continuously, is to deny even the name, to ignore the name or not mention the name or not speak of the name, is in a way trying to deny that the people existed in the first place, is to deny the actual existence of people. And when you do not see people as somebody with a name or an entity with a name, it makes it a lot more easier to kill them, to eradicate them, to remove them, because you don't see them as human. And you'll see in the language of the Zionists continuously, they are animals, they are savages. They will say anything and everything apart from calling them Palestinian, because to call them Palestinian would be to humanize them in that sense, right? So the name is important. For us as Muslims, for example, Allah Ta'ala gave us our name. He called us Muslim in the Quran, right? And as a result, he gave the name of our Deen, Islam, and he gave the name of who we are, which is the people who follow Islam, Muslim. We can see that in that context, that if the West had it their way, they would try to eradicate even this name that we have of being a Muslim. They tried with Mohammedans and this, that, and the other. It didn't work. Alhamdulillah for the Quran and Islam. So what you see here, the point I'm making is that this is why having a name is important. And this is why the Palestinians, for many Muslims, sometimes you do not understand why they are fighting for this name, because they're fighting for the idea that they lived on a place that had this name and they were the inhabitants of this place prior to the arrival of the Zionist movement, right? In that context.
Yeah. So like the name of the land itself has always been Palestine, whether there was Jews, Muslims, Christians, whoever lived on it. The name of the land has always been Palestine. I don't think a lot of people think about this point. Israel, for example, is the name of a tribe, or it's the name of the children of Yakub, basically.
Yeah.
So people don't realize that when people say that this was never Palestine, it was Israel, that's historically and categorically actually not true. The name of the people that settled there were the children. That's why they say the land of the Israelites. So, or the children of Israel. They were settlers on that land. They moved into that land. But even before that, the land itself had, its own names like Canaan or Palestine.
Exactly.
The oldest records.
And one of the things that we learn in Ottoman history, which is fascinating, which is that some of the nation states that emerged from the post-Ottoman period, what they did is they had to go beyond the Ottoman period as a way of giving themselves legitimacy because they didn't want to be attached to the Ottoman past. So I'll give you an example. The Egyptians, when they tried to create this national idea, they went all the way back to the pharaohs. In Albania, unfortunately, the Albanians, look at them, or unfortunately for them, and unfortunately for us, they couldn't move beyond the Ottoman experience. So their national heroes became Skenderbeg, who was an Ottoman soldier who then rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, because they couldn't create an imagination beyond that. What the Zionists did is because they don't have a presence in the region, they've never had a historical presence in the region, they had to go beyond Islam, way back in history, to find some remnants to give them a justification that they deserve to be here. Because one of the interesting things about Zionists in particular, when it comes to the field of Ottoman studies, is that they are the only people who have not indigenously been there since the Ottoman period. But they are one of the people that write the most amount of works of Ottoman history. Because what they're doing when they're writing works on Ottoman history is that not only are they taking away Palestinian lands, Palestinian lives, Palestinian livelihoods, they're taking away their memories, because they take agency from the fact that they can write about the memories of people who were there, and the actual inhabitants of that land don't have that same level of agency. Not only that, they write about Islam, they write about Islamic studies, they write about Ottoman history, but the reverse is not possible. We're not given the same level of agency. So it tells you something about how they have attained a level of intellectual capital, right, in their quest to be able to write this. And that intellectual capital that they have about writing about Ottoman history in many ways gives them the legitimacy that they have a right to be there as a result of that. And this is dangerous, I think. And this is where we need to think about this intellectual sort of like pushback in many ways. And this is why I've encouraged so many Muslims to start studying the Islamic history, Yani, because it gives you some sort of intellectual capital.
Do you, so on that point about the land being Palestine, can you give us a sense of what groups lived on that land, and were Jews or Christians ever excluded really from living on the land? I mean, I don't think that in a Muslim mind it was never that the Jews were excluded from living on the land, right?
Yes.
Islam was never a religious one per se. Matter of fact, Muslim leaders have always invited Jews to live on that land.
So if you see historically, we haven't. I mean, we see in the case of Umar bin Khattab, radiallahu anh, for example, when Umar had taken Palestine, he allowed the Jews to come back who were being persecuted by the Christians at the time.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind.
Right,
yeah,
right. He allowed them to return, and they had always stayed there since that time. And there's a book by an academic. Her name is Michelle Campos. She's written a book called Ottoman Brothers, where she looks at the tail end of Abdul Hamid's period, but the Young Turk period in particular, about how Jews were living on the land of what we call today's Palestine. And she uses the word Palestine in the book because there's no other name to call that area to some degree. And Jews were living there and in peace. When we go to the old area of the Aqsa compound and then the old city, we have what we call the Armenian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and then the Jewish quarter. This is not like, beyond our imagination. And we don't see any form of discrimination. In fact, when the Spanish Inquisition was taking place, a lot of Jews from Spain migrated to the Ottoman Empire in places like Salonika. This is why when we call them the what do you call it? It's on the next slide here. The Sephardic Jews, in particular, these are the Iberian Jews that came from Spain and then resided in Salonika, Istanbul, Jerusalem, and we have a lot of Jews who lived in Baghdad, in Iraq, and we don't see evidence of them being persecuted in any way. And this is, I think, an important point to stress this, that the idea which they've created in their mind somehow is that a Muslim by his nature is anti-Semitic. It's just nonsense. In reality, it's absolute nonsense.
I remember once I was on a plane and there was this guy next to me and he had just finished his time with the IDF, right? So he was an American Israeli Jew, and I was talking to him, and this was like maybe a year back. So then I asked him, I said that, hey, how were weren't the Jews treated well during the Ottoman period? And he said yes, right? He actually accepted this. So like a Jew who's part of the IDF, he's actually accepting this. Like, what bigger testament can there be to that?
I think the great thing about Jerusalem in particular, because it's an important center for us as Muslims, and it's an important center for Christians and Jews as well, the studies on Jerusalem have been extensive. Okay, alhamdulillah. And the studies on Jerusalem and Quds have shown that the Jews living in that region really did not have a problem with the authorities or the Muslims that they were living with. I mean, would there have been confessional tensions from time to time amongst peoples? Probably. But the type of, scaremongering that they're trying to put forward in terms of that living with Muslims is just hell, it's a lie. And there's enough evidence to suggest that. In fact, this is why I like Michelle Campos's book that I mentioned to you, because she talks about Jewish writers calling the Ottoman Empire the homeland, the motherland. We are brothers. We are Ottoman brothers. They're using these types of terminology. And in fact, when the Israeli state was being created and when Zionism was first being exported or imported to the Ottoman lands, the Jews were shocked by it. They said, well, what are you doing? What's going on here? We're not interested in this project because this project was very European. And Jews in the Ottoman Empire, just like most subjects and then citizens of the Ottoman Empire, were aware of the way that Jews were being treated in Europe, and that European nationalism was very antagonistic towards peoples that they didn't consider to be part of their group. And we see that today in the West. The West is very antagonistic towards Muslims in the way that they were antagonistic towards Jews. Now, the way that the Jews have offset that historically after the Holocaust is to align themselves in a civilizational framework to say that we are part of this civilizational world. And Muslims has still been considered as the other. Even when they create the framework of that this is the Abrahamic faith, the idea of being Abrahamic was not something that Muslims had coined. It was something that was coined later on by Western thinkers, in the idea that you have the three religions of the Abrahamic, from Ibrahim alayhi salam, but the Muslims were at the bottom of this pyramid. That at the top was the Christians and Jews in terms of their enlightened civilizations, and then the Muslims were at the bottom of this, and we're just including them for the sake of, you know, some sort of like liberal justification. But we haven't really been included in regards to culture. In fact, you can see that European society was constructed on the back end of the separation of church and state and the antagonism it had towards the Muslims in the region. And that was a genuine fear for them. And so now Muslims who are living in Europe in particular are seeing the type of language the governments are using towards them, the inability to allow them to protest, the inability to allow them to have a voice, for children to get into trouble for saying anything pro-Palestinian is no different than the ways that the Europeans were treating the Jews in Europe at the time, and Ottoman Jews never had that problem. They just didn't.
For the viewers or for those who are listening, would it be fair to basically summarize this and say that Zionism itself, it's really a political project from Europe, essentially, and not really a religious project? Because I know, like Herzl and the founders of Zionism themselves were atheists.
Yeah, 100%.
Even though they said that this land was promised by God to the Jews,
like it's more European than it is Jewish.
Yeah, 100%.
Continuation of that colonial past, basically.
You will see, and I will show you today, that 100% the Zionist mindset comes from this sort of like ethno-nationalism that comes from Europe, and this type of secularism, which is very European. So if we see the capitalist discourse, the communist discourse, the Zionist discourse, the Nazi discourse, right? All of these discourses are coming from European societies at a point when they have reduced the role of religion as being a moral framework of what it means to be human, and replaced it with a secular framework, which has always been European, and as a result has spread a lot of violence around the world. And then this idea was imported, or shall I say, like it was exported from Europe and imported to the region, which it doesn't make sense to the region. And the way that they put a cover on it is to say, but we're the only democracy in the region. We're the only enlightened people in the region.
Yeah, I made this point to someone the other day. They were saying that, look at this. A lot of liberals are kind of siding on the Palestinian side. Obviously, it's not for the same reasons, kind of, because they don't have the Islamic paradigm which we're coming at it from. So they'll say that, you know, the Israeli or the IDF, they're doing this on the back of religion, and religion is the thing that's propagating so much mass murder and all of these kind of things. We need to do away with religion. And I basically made the point that, you know, the murder and the killing and the genocide and all of that that's happening right now, this is not because of their religiosity. This is because of their lack of religiosity. Like anybody who believes in a 100%. God and they have to answer to a God, they would never do, you know, they wouldn't carry out, you know, the
100%. And speak to the Jews who are critical of the Zionist project, and they will tell you exactly this.
Yeah, it's based on their religion. That's why they're against it.
They're saying it. They will say that from our scripture we cannot do this because we know this.
One question here: what percentage of Jews are actually against the Zionist project worldwide? Because what they do is they make them sound like some fringe group, you know, that barely has any numbers.
I mean, I don't know where the data is to know what the numbers are. I think, you know, what's interesting historically, after the sort of like traumas of the Holocaust, there seems to be a particular sort of like language that's being created as a way of anyone who was critical of the state of Israel would have been seen as a particular traitor. Now, in the earlier period, there was more room for people to be critical. So if you see the works of like Norman Finkelstein and Chomsky and Ilan Pappé, these are all Israelis, Jews, by the way, who, I don't know if Chomsky was, but these are Jews in particular who write about the atrocities of the state of Israel and critique it. These are secular Jews, one. Then there are a host of religious rabbis who are calling this out. But now what we see in the current situation, which is interesting, is such an emotional language is being created, which is replicating the woke culture to some degree, in a way in which it's trying to silence any internal criticism and any external criticism in terms of the activities they're doing, because the violence is so aggressive and so clear that in the past they would have got away with it because the type of technologies we have today where we can see it live in action did not exist in the past. And so those type of crimes, when you would have said, 60,000 people were killed, and they would have said, well, I don't know, it's about 1,000 people. Whereas now they can't do that. They can't say that there were not 500 people in a hospital. They cannot say that Hamas bombed the hospital. They cannot say that 40 heads are being beheaded because you have the evidence.
Yeah,
and
social media really changed the game here.
It totally blew it up, right?
Yeah,
and this is where they're frustrated, yeah. So this is the point. But anyway, let me go to this slide initially first. So we have enough evidence to say that the name Palestine was being used. Okay, so for example, in 1902, Ibn al-Faqih, he was an alim. He used the word Palestine, and by the 17th century, Arab scholars were using the word Palestine in their works. In 1804, and I've put these two links here. I'll send it to you guys later. You can find the printed maps of the area in which the word Palestine is being used in the Ottoman maps, for example. So it's clear that the tension in the Ottoman period was not between the use of the word Palestine, but in the late 19th century, the Ottomans wanted to put more emphasis on the area of Palestine as a district by heightening the status of Aqsa. And so when they were trying to reorganize the provincial boundaries, the question was, should some of the cities be part of Palestine or should some of the cities be part of Bilad Sham, right? And so you had near Nablus and so forth, these sort of cities. But by and large, this is not being disputed that the word Palestine is being used. Even in the Ottoman Empire in 1914, for example, there was an Arabic newspaper called Falastin. So this is consistent. And when Muslims will ask me why they're using this name, you say, Muslims, like the word dirham and dinar, are not, they're not Islamic names. We just took them and then we adjusted them. The Hagia Sophia, it's Uskudar in Turkey is Skutari. The Bosphorus is Bosphorus. Istanbul was Istanbulis. Constant. So Muslims really don't have that sort of inferior complex of feeling the need to just keep changing names of places. It doesn't exist. So if a person becomes Muslim and he wants to be David, he doesn't have to be Dawood. He can stay David. We don't care, so long as he's fulfilling his requirements. It's just that most people who become Muslim, they want to then acquire a particular culture. So Islam doesn't have that. Now, Ottoman period Jerusalem, as I mentioned to you guys, right? And we spoke about this then, so I can skip over this. But the main types of Jews that we had in the Ottoman domains was Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews. And these were the Middle Eastern Jews, so places like Yemen, Iraq, places in Iran, and Egypt and so forth. And then you had the Iberian Jews who had sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire when the Inquisition was taking place against them and Muslims. In the 19th century, we see a lot of works where the 19th century is a period of it's a Renaissance period in regards to Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, Armenian, and Ladino, the script that the Jews were using in terms of the Sephardic Jews. And we see that this is a moment of intellectual production, in fact. So this is a high moment for them within the Ottoman Empire. What's intriguing is when you read a lot of the ideas and works of Jews at the time, and non-Muslims as well, that they are resonating with works of Muslims. They're talking about justice. They're talking about ethics. They're talking about morality, because this would have been the zeitgeist in regards to living in the Muslim world. And you would see crossovers and similarities between these various religious groups in terms of speaking. Why? Because the canopy that they were living under was Islam, right? And now today, the canopy that people are living under is secularism. So a lot of the language has become secular. So this is
they're just trying to match the status quo.
Exactly, because when you're a person who doesn't have power, and what I mean by that is a civilizational power, right? Then what you do is you couch onto, or you piggyback on the back of the civilization that's dominant. And one of the things that we see about the Zionist project, in order for it to survive, one of the decisions it made was that it was necessary for the Zionist project to piggyback on a superpower or global power to permit its survival. It first did it with the British. It's now doing it with the United States of America. And so the uniqueness of the Zionist project in many ways is dependent on sitting on the sort of like, sitting on the superpower, and it's established a unique relationship over time where it's almost become amalgamated with that superpower to some degree, especially the United States of America.
I had a question about, so we have the Sephardic Jews, and we have the Mizrahi Jews, and then we also have the what's called the Ashkenazi. So are these different classes? Do the Jews see themselves in these categories, and do they treat each other differently based on these sort of categorizations, or do they see themselves as a monolith?
So they don't see themselves as a monolith, but they don't also see themselves as these. I mean, they would argue maybe differently, but from my understanding, it's not a hierarchy. It's just a differentiation of areas that they're from, right?
Because I remember when some of the like a lot of Yemeni Jews came into Israel,
right?
They were actually looked down upon. Their children were given over to Ashkenazis because they weren't white enough, for example.
Okay, and that is the baggage of Zionism. It's not the baggage of Judaism, actually. That's the baggage of Zionism, but as the Zionist state is an ethno-nationalist, racist state. And in actuality, even mistreats people of color in its own state, even if they proclaim themselves as being Jewish. This is the irony of that state, right? And why? Because the majority of the inhabitants that carried the sort of like banner of the state of Zionism were European. And the Ashkenazi Jews are generally the Jews that came from Poland and Germany and so forth. They were European Jews, right? So this is what's interesting. And even we have to be honest right now, there is a tension in Israel at the moment as well right now. The idea that, I mean, a lot of Israelis themselves are uncomfortable with the idea that they have to be in a continuous state of war, which is part of the doctrine about the Israeli state, which is has to be a continual conflict. There's a continual paranoia. There's a continual enemy, and they need to find one. And most people in Tel Aviv just want to party, drink, and sleep around. They're not interested in this stuff anymore. So what is the state doing? The right is taking these kids and using them as cannon fodder in Gazzah as a way of trying to bring the society back into some sort of parity. And it's
basically the religious justification is untenable when you have a secular society, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the things that secularism does is that secularism presents itself as a referee that's valueless and that's equalizing everyone. In fact, it's not a referee, it's a hakam, it's a judge, and it's value laden. And what it does is it basically suppresses anyone that doesn't subscribe to the secular worldview by crushing it and giving incentives to those that subscribe to the worldview of secularism. Hindutva is a secular ideology. When the Rohingya were being killed by the Buddhists in Myanmar, it was the secular ideology of Buddhism that they were carrying. It's the Zionist is a secular ideology. To some degree, you are seeing that while they have what you could say aspects of religious identity to it, what they do not do is subscribe to scripture. What they subscribe to is the secular framework, right? So I mentioned this to you about the types of people, and Shlomo Yelin was he was the person who was a Jew who was talking about this, and in this quote, I liked it. He said, "We are thirsty for progress and ameliorations since we have been deprived for 32 years from this pleasure, and we have lost the most beautiful years of our youth under the pressure." And he was talking about Abdul Hamid. But then he goes, "You do not have to take a glance around. You see what we have to do. The cities and rural areas are the saddest state. We, with the exception of very few areas, agriculture and animal husbandry and blah, blah, blah." And then he's basically saying at the bottom, because legislation is full of obstacles. So he's critiquing the Ottoman Empire. And then he's saying your beautiful career of civil servants. He wants to be part of the Ottoman Empire. So he's critiquing the Ottoman government by saying that, which was the zeitgeist at the time because of Young Turks, that I want to be part of this world, but things have been very difficult for the last 30 years for all of us. And we want the revolution that I'm supporting, which is the Young Turk revolution, will make it easy for all of us to once again live together hand in hand. So the idea is that they saw themselves as people attached to the empire, that they could critique their government. And I deliberately wanted to put this quote out there to say that, he wasn't critiquing his government as a person who was saying that we, the Jews, have been suppressed. He was critiquing the government just like anyone critiques the government as a subject of the state. We want things to be better, right? And so this is how integrated they were. And then the problem starts here. The arrival of the ultra-nationalistic ideas from Europe started to be noticed. And the biggest problem, what you notice in this time, is modernity. Modernity creates schisms within the Jewish community. It really hurts it, in the sense that, on the one hand, Jews generally are happy to be in their little enclaves, living amongst particular communities and areas. And now modernity is ripping that away from them. And they have to start to make choices. And Jews in Europe, are displaying very different visions of what it means to be Jewish than the ones that are living in the Ottoman Empire, right? So for many Ottoman Jews, and this work is extensive as well, Zionism was considered as a betrayal to the homeland, right? It's like, this is unacceptable. So when the early Zionists were promoting these ideas, what's even more interesting is when you have those waves of Ashkenazi Jews coming over, like Herzl, Ben Gurion, Yitzhak Ben-Gvir, that these guys, they came and lived in the Ottoman domains. They studied in Istanbul. They learned Arabic. They learned Turkish and got Ottoman passports. Now, people would say, well, why didn't the Ottomans stop that? Because at that time, the Ottomans would never have had imagined that this is what these people are calling for. They would have said, okay, it's, they might have said, okay, these people are a bit extreme with their views and all right, whatnot, but we're never going to give them Palestine. It's not going to happen. So, they came in and they said, look, we don't have a home to go to. Can you help us out? We're being persecuted in Europe. And the Ottomans said, fine, come over. You can live here, you can work here, you can trade here. And it once again shows that the reason why the Ottoman allowed a lot of these early Zionist thinkers to reside in the Ottoman domains is because the Ottomans saw them as Jewish. They did not see them as the founding fathers of Zionism, because for that you would have had to have an imagination that the Zionist project is possible, right? And that was not part of their imagination. They just thought that these people are thinkers in that way. So World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, right? So World War I is where the major shift happens in terms of how the area of Palestine becomes dismantled. And what we see is that both World War I and World War II, they become opportune moments for the Zionists because of weaknesses for particular powers. So in World War I, it was the Ottomans who had become weak and collapsed. And in World War II, it was the collapse of the British Empire. So these two wars, to some degree, they permitted the Zionists particular opportunities. So one of the things that we should learn from this is that when there is a moment in history, and when there is something taking place in history, that people should learn to take the opportunities that arrive during those moments. And so I will say to all your viewers today that right now it's a moment. It's a moment, Yani. It's a heavy price we're paying. The Ummah is paying a heavy price, especially the people of Gaza. But if the Ummah do not wake up from this moment that's being created, right, we say, khalas, we're not going to go back to the same laziness as before, then something is so horribly wrong, because these are the moments, Ibn Khaldun talks about them. He says there are moments in history where an event happens and it shifts, it speeds up a moment of a momentum, right?
It's cataclysmic, yeah.
Exactly.
I actually made that point in my recent khutbah. I told the people that if what we're literally seeing with our own eyes isn't enough to wake us up, then, I don't know what will wake us. Like, we deserve, I guess you can almost say, like, you deserve to be in the position if something like this doesn't wake you up.
I honestly believe this. I was reading Surah Ma'idah yesterday, and I honestly believe this. When Allah Ta'ala says that when people don't do the work of Allah Ta'ala, then He creates a new generation. Then how is a new generation created? A new generation is created from a particular experience. This current generation has seen this. This current generation is seeing the lies. The current generation is seeing the way that they're being viewed, how they're being seen. And in that sense, it's for people like us to now raise that generation that Allah Ta'ala has now create it and say, okay, it's going to be different for you. It's going to be different for your kids. It's not going to be the same. It should not be the same. We should not allow that to happen, right? So here what we see in 1911 is the Italians invade Libya, and then the Ottomans have the war in the Balkans in 1912 and 13. So the Ottomans are already involved in the war, sort of like machinery, before World War One. And they're being heavily, what you can call like entrenched in the sort of like the framework of war. And so by the time we get to 1918, the Ottomans have had humongous losses. Right? This third point here, the Ottoman Empire took the largest toll of losses than any other nation in World War One. It totaled to about 3 million people who had died in World War One for the Ottoman Empire. And that's 15%. And the next closest country is France and Germany that only saw 4 to 5% loss. So imagine, like, it's not just a psychological loss, it's the human capital. And when people ask me, why were the Ottomans not able to fight off these various empires? It's the human capital, they didn't have it. You don't have an infinite amount of soldiers to fight for you. Whereas the colonial powers were drawing people from India, drawing people from Australia, drawing people from Algeria. So one of the problems the Ottomans had was this human capital, right? In being able to stop.
Yeah, that's an important fact. I think a lot of people don't really know.
Yeah.
That the 15% of its population, and just because it's not highlighted, right? People have their focus mostly on Europe at that time.
Right, and one of the things they don't realize is that devastation was so seismic. That's why the nation states were possible, right? Because when your society has been that smashed, and we're talking about forced migrations, we're talking about the destruction of agriculture, we're talking about all sorts of mechanisms, to the point that the people are tired, they're exhausted, and a whole generation has been wiped out. And the only generation that are left are people that are elderly, unable to fight, or the young, and they could be indoctrinated in the new sort of like program.
And severely traumatized.
Totally. I mean, we keep telling people, for example, that Islam should be the language that can help people fighting. But for 10 years, for 15 years, it's difficult. I have friends who are Syrian. It's exhausting. It doesn't mean that they haven't got tawakkul in Allah Ta'ala, but imagine, like, if you're going to tell someone in Gaza who's suffering to say, have trust in Allah Ta'ala. What are you doing here? Have some shame. In the end of the day, they already have trust in Allah Ta'ala. They're calling for Allah Ta'ala. But would you blame them if they felt tired? If they felt exhausted? If they said, stop the bombs? Okay, enough. We're out. Time out for us, please. You couldn't blame people who are going through this level of extremity, because this is what it means to be human, right? So, alhamdulillah, what we're seeing, however, is even children, their iman is so tight. The iman is so tight. It's not for us to critique the iman of the people in Gaza when they're showing us what iman is, yani. If it wasn't for the people of Palestine, Quds would have been gone a long time ago. They've been holding
just bring me back. I shared a video not too long ago, probably 2 hours ago, of a girl. They're still digging her out of the rubble.
SubhanAllah, I saw that video.
Giving a shahada.
Yes.
That shook me. I
couldn't girl, right? 7, 8 years old or something.
Yeah.
She was like 7 years old or something. Like, I have a daughter that's about 7 years old.
It's
and
crazy.
It just shook me to my core. Like, you can't imagine what kind of how these kids have been brought up. Like,
Right. Look, I tell you something. When the earthquake happened here in Turkey, I learned, and I had come to Chicago after that. I learned that this ummah is resilient, and this ummah is strong, and this ummah trusts Allah Ta'ala. And I'm thinking to myself, this ummah is amazing. Like, what is the leadership doing, Yani? What is the leadership doing? Because these people will run through brick walls for you. Look at them, and that's what
the beautiful thing is that this ummah can learn iman from a 7-year-old of this ummah.
Alhamdulillah, yeah.
Which is something that you can't find anywhere else. I don't think so. That we can look to our children and get strength from them and their iman, where they're still half buried in rubble.
That's right.
Injured completely, almost half unconscious, and she's saying Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
That's right.
I was just moved.
Yeah, same.
SubhanAllah, there's some people, they'll make the point that the reason the rulers are bad is because the people are bad, right? The people are bad, they don't have iman, and they're far away from Deen, and that's why we have bad rulers. But the problem is, like, those people, they don't have much knowledge of history, that those rulers are not representative of the people. They've been imposed. So it's a conscious and concerted effort to take the worst of the populace and impose them upon the best.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this type of what I call self-deprecation, it needs to stop, Yani. Would you say that about Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun? What are you talking about? What Allah Ta'ala expects from us is to challenge the authority. Rasulullah was in the time of the Quraysh. What are we saying here? Like it's the objective to challenge the authority in that sense. So it's not the idea of using our leadership to say that the Ummah deserve it or the Ummah are not good or so forth. What it is if anything, it's an indication that there is more of a responsibility of people like us who know to speak up and speak the truth, Yani, to speak on behalf of the Ummah, to help them, to carry them through this. We need to stand up and be counted. Otherwise, we're just going to be feeling sorry for ourselves for the rest of our lives. And in the West, they don't feel that way. They don't say that about their leadership. They move on. So this is something the Ummah needs to move on from, inshallah.
So before the Balfour Declaration, I wanted to ask, I'm not sure if you've included the correspondence between the Sharif of Mecca and
Sykes-Picot. Yeah, so I was going to talk about it. It's here, the Husayn-Macmahon agreements.
Yes, okay.
So basically, in World War One, and this is another complexity which people don't appreciate, which is that they see the Arabs. They use the word Arabs in a sort of like one size fits all, and they'll say the Arabs were basically rebelled against the Ottoman empires and were traitors, and that's not true. What it was, there are some complexities here and some layers to it. The first layer is that Sharif Hussein was put in charge of Makkah by Abdul Hamid II. He had studied in Istanbul, and a lot of times the Ottoman Empire, the way that power was, it was negotiated. So various people were ruling over their own areas, and they just negotiated with the Sultan. And so obedience is not just given; obedience has to be earned. And there could be various reasons why local rulers at times clashed with the central authority. Now, when the Young Turks came to power, they didn't want Sharif Hussein in power because they saw him as a loyalist of Abdul Hamid II, right? So they wanted to remove him. But he wasn't going to move because he had the local support and so on, right? And so tensions grew between Sharif Hussein and the Young Turks in that sense. And when World War I happened, Jamal Pasha in particular, was concerned that Sharif Hussein is not supporting the Ottoman effort in the way that he wanted. Sharif Hussein was nervous that Jamal Pasha was going to use this as a pretext to remove him from authority. And this paranoia on both sides was then exploited by the British. And then finally, when Jamal Pasha had heard that some members from Bilad al-Sham were talking to the British, he executed them on the side of treason. What that did is that consolidated the Sharif Hussein, that see the Young Turks are out to get me, and so on. And so this continued.
Can you talk a bit about the Young Turks and how their Young Turks, Ottoman Empire?
Sure. So let me just quickly finish and I'll jump back. So this tension between the two created this situation, and Sharif Hussein, who thought that the Ottoman Empire would collapse, then put his states on the side of the British. And the British obviously made particular promises to him by saying that we will make you the Arab Caliph and so on, right? But in the end, what to Sharif Hussein's surprise, or the surprise to his children as well, was that the British had made a secret agreement with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was that they were going to, fracture the region and share it amongst themselves. And Sharif Hussein was actually not going to get the type of deal that he expected. But there were many Arab tribes who were fighting for the Ottoman warfare. This is why this is important, because Palestine in particular lost a lot of manpower because a lot of men from Palestine had gone to fight in the Ottoman war effort as well. Now, the Young Turks...
Was he promised Palestine also as part of the Arab lands?
Yes. In those secret agreements, yes. He would have thought that he would have had the whole Arab region in that sense. Now, the Young Turks are basically a group of soldiers, primarily, but thinkers in exile, and even people who were Muslim, who felt that the reign of Abdul Hamid II had become stifling for them. And so they enacted a revolution against Abdul Hamid to remove him from power and to replace him with his brother. And in return, they wanted to create a parliamentary constitutional system in which they could use the parliament to be the main agents in parliament and have that level of control and authority over the decision-making process in the Ottoman domains. And what happened is when they came to power, the reason why they had pushed through this revolution is because while Abdul Hamid was very skilled in maintaining the balance of the empire, their frustration was, one, that they were not being included in the decision-making process, and two, that the Western powers were still chipping away at the Ottoman Empire. And as military men, they wanted to get back what had been lost. And they were part of this bravado and so forth. Now, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about the Young Turks being Zionists and the Young Turks being Freemasons. But the evidence on that still needs to be questioned. It's very hard to, when you look at during the Young Turk period, they would never have allowed the Zionists to have a state in Palestine. That would have been impossible for them. And you can see this when Enver Pasha turns up in World War I and so forth. But these were the guys, and they were like a sort of like a movement that became a political movement. And the majority of the men who were military men,
So were the Young Turks like modernists, or no?
So this is the interesting thing. So they're not a homogenous group. They are a group, what you would call, who band together on certain principles. And the principles were constitutionalism. The principles were of emphasizing the idea of Turkishness as a way of, so they believed that even the Arabs should know Turkish and so on. And a lot of Arabs got frustrated by that. The idea that, why are you emphasizing this Turkishness? Are you trying to Turkify the empire and so on, right? Especially when you see what was happening in terms of the modern period, that nervousness was there. They believed in a process of being expansionists as a military wing and so forth. But they were inconsistent because they were a new group who had not had a crystallized manifesto of what it meant to be a member of the movement. So in that sense, they were kind of ad hoc at times. So on. But anyway, going back to this. So after Sykes and Picot, what we have when the British take over Palestine after defeat of the Ottomans. So the Ottomans lose the Arab provinces in 1917, 1918. And then there is an independent war, which we call the War of Independence, that's taking place in Turkey at the time, which the Ottomans are still fighting until 1922. But the Arab provinces have been lost. And the British then take Palestine, right? And this is the declaration. And it's interesting because the British offer Palestine to the Queen for a Christmas gift in December the 25th. When the French arrived to Damascus, the French governor general at the time kicked the tomb of Salahuddin and said, "We're back." So what's intriguing is that in a strange way, in their imagination, they still had these imaginations of representing the Crusaders. It never left them in a strange way. And I'll tell you what's interesting, because I'm from England. When Brexit was happening in England, there was a campaign by some of the Brexiteers, and it was the Turk. If you don't vote Brexit, the Turks are coming. And what that was doing is that evoked the memory that Suleiman the Magnificent was going to turn up with his horses. And what was intriguing is, while English folks understood that form of referencing, that form of doublespeak, Muslims didn't. They didn't understand what was going on because they were dislocated from that type of memory. That memory is a memory that exists of people who are born on a country, they identify with it, and they have a particular historical memory, right? And it's the same thing here, but we're seeing there's the soldiers coming over, that they were evoking particular language, which when you read it and you look at it, you just think, wow, I mean, this is interesting. If a Muslim evoked memories like that, you'd be called an extremist or a terrorist.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting if we gather up all of these sort of like little dog whistles.
And
really see what they actually mean. It kind of gives an indication to the psychological underpinnings of what their aims are.
100%. So let's look at Balfour. What he says, he goes, His Majesty's government's view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So he mentions the word Palestine as the name of the land, right? That's clear because there's no other name to give it. And he says of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. He mentions the Jewish people. He mentions that this is a homeland for the Jews. He mentions other people that are non-Jewish, but he doesn't say who they are. He doesn't call them Palestinian. He doesn't call them Muslim. He doesn't call them Arab. That was deliberate. And when I said to you about why having a name is important and why many people are fighting for the idea of being Palestinian, you can see from Balfour that the idea that one group is visible and another group is invisible. It's not there. It doesn't have a right to exist, right? And this was what Balfour puts out there. And it was a lot of the people who were living on the land at the time, the Palestinians, they were shocked by this. They're like, what's going on here? Like, do we not exist? Or what's he talking about? Now, prior to World War I, a lot of the markers people would have used were religious markers. They would have said, to be a Turk meant to be a Muslim, and so forth. Here, they didn't use Muslim, they didn't use Arab, they didn't use Palestinian. They just removed it, right?
Aside from the glaring fact that they're not even following what's written here, because there's still prejudice and discrimination going on.
100%. So, and the point I'm making here is that, so what you can see is that inbuilt within the Zionist mindset is a particular trauma of the Holocaust, which has been amplified, in which they've created a siege mentality, in which they think it's us versus the rest of the world. One, so whatever. But two, at the same time, they've created an idea that the Palestinians are just not human. They've never been visible. They've never been here. They deny them that they've ever been here. They've never been here. It's like, who are these people that we're bombing? They're not even there. They're not even in these hospitals. 1,000 people. What are you talking about? It must be about 10. This is the interesting thing. So what were Britain's intentions? It was a philo-Semitic. So philo-Semitic is a term that's controversial, but it's used by Rashid Khalidi. And Rashid Khalidi's 100 Years of War is a very good book on the 100-year history of modern Palestine. So I really recommend it to read that. And Khalidi, the Khalidi family in particular, so their grandfather was the governor of Jerusalem, and their grandfather's brother, so I don't know how you say that in English, he was an alim who established the first library in Quds, called the Khalidiyya Library. So he was part of a Ulumi family in that sense now. And he says that a philo-Semitic return of the Hebrews to the land of the Bible. So there was this imagination by some of these secular Brits, at least, that they still wanted to return the Jews to the promised land. They had bought into this biblical imagination, which is interesting because on so many occasions when you speak to Zionists and they try to use the Bible or the Torah as a reference point to indicate their right to exist in that land. Could you imagine as a Muslim if I used the Quran in the same way? It just wouldn't happen. So how is it possible that this type of terminology and language is possible, right? Even though they don't hang up to it. The other point is the West was very anti-Semitic. So on the one hand, it was philo-Semitic. It had a particular imagination, a positive imagination of sending them to Palestine. But on the other hand, it was anti-Semitic. It didn't want the Jews in Europe. It didn't want them in Europe. So rather than having the Jews in Europe, they said, let's just go to Palestine, get them out of here. This is the British intention. And the British intention, the last intention was they wanted to geopolitically control the place. If they have a proxy in the region, right? Because they were still not sure to what degree these Arab rulers would be compliant. So to have a proxy in the region, we could use that as a point to be able to, regulate the region when we see fit. And these were the three main ideas. And the British
I think the third idea there is one that a lot of people don't usually bring to mind. I know we're talking about the historical importance of all of these, but I think the current political importance of point number 3, which is the geopolitical control of the region, that can be counted out. That's like incredibly important, at least nowadays. Going forward, I think it's going to be more important.
You know what? It's not even like the geopolitical in terms of the physical politics of the land, of strategic, of building a shipyard and canal and so forth. It's also the idea that if the Israeli state, the apartheid state collapses, the Western project globally collapses. It shatters the imagination and the image of like the quwwah, the strength of the West in many ways. If the Zionist project folds, the West itself can no longer run the world. And so as a result, it has to plow its resources into that project because that project has to survive, because if it doesn't, that's the beginning of you say you're only as strong as the weakest link. That is the weakest link. That link breaks, and there's all sorts of maneuvering taking place around the world globally, and they know
like
that.
The last vestige of political influence, I guess you could say, in Asia and beyond.
Totally, and it's not so. You know, in that sense, the global South would just like start to say, "Hang on a minute," and actually, you can see in many ways that the Americans as well don't have the same amount of strength that they had in the past, especially because of the drainage of Afghanistan and Iraq. So what they do is they will send over ships, just to let you know. And I'll give you an example. When Timur Lane, defeated Bayezid II, he came with his whole army and he defeated Bayezid. But when his son Shah Rukh Khan was in power, Shah Rukh, what he did is rather than bringing an army, he just sometimes sent a militia unit to the border area, the frontier area of the Ottoman Empire, to let them know, don't mess around. The Ottomans then, they submitted to Timur, Shah Rukh, but they were still pushing the buttons as well because they realized you're not as strong as you used to be. Because before you came and you wiped us out. So one of the things that, and the thing about power is a sense of hubris. It doesn't want to appreciate that it's on a downward spiral. And this is where we need to really understand that this sort of might that the West has, a lot of it is falling apart in front of our eyes. It's absolutely, as a historian, to see it and document it, and then to see that power just is always in denial is something else.
I had one question on the last slide. So you mentioned, for example, before that, the Jews, the European Jews who started the Zionist project, they viewed themselves, or they were more European than they were Jewish, right? In a sense. But here, for example, on point number 2, that because of the anti-Semitism in the West, they didn't want Jews. So was it that the Europeans didn't, like the European Jews, they viewed themselves as more European than Jewish, but the Europeans didn't view them as totally European? Was it like a one-way street with them too?
The example I use is Muslims in the West.
Yeah.
When you speak to a Muslim in the West, they say, I'm American. They say, these people can't stand you. What are you talking about? Are you really? Are you kidding me? Right. You go to England. I go to England all the time, and people say, I'm British. I'm a British Muslim. I'm proud to be British. And I'll give you an example. I was coming over to London to visit my family, and I was coming back to Turkey, and I had a one-way ticket because I live here. And I was stopped at the airport by the services, and they pulled me to a side and said, you have a one-way ticket to Turkey. Why? And I said, what do you mean? Why? It's none of your business. Why? And they thought that I was going to go to Syria and cause trouble. So then we had this like palaver. They were making me miss my flight. Anyway, I pulled out a letter. Luckily for me, it was signed by Tayyip Erdogan. So I pulled it out, said, look, I'm going to a particular conference. I live in Turkey. And then the guy says to me, Mr. Ahmed. I said, no, that's Dr. Ahmed to you. He goes, okay, Dr. Ahmed, are you proud to be British? And I said, that's a racist question. He goes, what do you mean? I said, you're asking if I'm grateful. You would never ask a white person this question. And this is something that has always been an experience of my life, that I've lived in Britain, but I know that I'm not the same type of citizen. I just know it. And now we can feel it with the Palestinian issue. We can feel it. Okay, you're living here, but these are the rules. Shut your mouth, know your role, and just stay in the corner. If you do that, then we don't have a problem with you. But if you try to express what it means to be Muslim, and I think this is the same with the Jews and Herzl and so forth. In one way, they are contaminated by the ideas of like the post-Enlightenment. They're contaminated and looking at the ideas of the civilizational discourse of European society and the West. They are part of that. But on the other hand, there's a recognition that, you know what, we're not equal citizens. They don't want us here. They don't want us to be here. And we need to carve a home for ourselves, a state for ourselves, where we can be in power of ourselves in that sense, right? So this is the idea. And it's not that too different than what, most people call for, which is that you should be in charge of your own family.
And one last question on this last slide. So like you mentioned that they're always playing both sides. So when Muslims say that, okay, they didn't have any right to give the land of Palestine to the Jews. So what if someone retorts and says that, hey, they conquered that land, right? And therefore they have, who are you to say that they didn't have a right to, gift that land? Right.
Yeah, that's fine. They can gift it, but then the people have the right to resist. You don't take obedience from people just because you took the land, Yani. That's not how it works. Islamic history is full of this, that when we conquered lands, we didn't submit the people in draconian measures and say, okay, you have to put your head down, and if you don't, we're going to wipe you all out. In the end of the day.
Two questions here. Like one, I guess like maybe there could be two approaches to this. One is what you're saying, and the second is that, hey, in the Husayn-Macmahon agreement, there was actually an agreement. So even based on that, they didn't have any right because they already had a word, or gave their word. Could that be a stance or not really?
The problem is that it wasn't in writing. It wasn't legally held. But this then this opens up another can of worms. But it's important now then. Who does international law favor and apply to? Right? The idea, so in the 19th century, we had this framework of international laws. There wasn't a one streamlined international law. There was many different empires like the Qing dynasty, the Meiji dynasty in Japan, the Ottoman Empire, the Russians. They were all pushing to try to have some sort of like representation on the table as the world was becoming globalized. And so international law was a patchwork of different cultures putting down some sort of commonality. But by World War II, when the West were in absolute dominance over the world, they streamlined the law to favor them. International law is a framework that is created for the subjugated peoples to adhere to, but the powers to be able to ignore. We saw that in the American invasion of Iraq. We saw that in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We see that in the Israeli occupation, that international law does not apply to them in this context. So when we talk about, once again, when we go into this trap of like the laws are this, they've been ordained and so forth, it doesn't work for us. When we're following the rules, they are not following the rules, right? In that context. So here, even if they made an agreement with Sharif Hussein, which they broke continuously, consistently, what he was promised and what he was left with, which is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, his family, in the end, it tells you something, right? In that context. Even in Saudi Arabia, where they were supporting Sharif Hussein and his family, and just supporting the House of Saud and the Wahhabis on the other side to fight against each other to see who will come out on top. So a lot of these promises they broke consistently, and the only reason why Sykes-Picot was exposed was because of the Bolshevik Revolution. Because the Russians were on the side of the British and the French in World War I, and when the Bolshevik Revolution happened and the Bolsheviks then just exposed everything, the Arabs got shocked. Like, what the hell? We're being played here, in this sense. So one of the things that you're learning is that, even now when we're seeing American support for the Israelis, it's like they're saying, we're giving you a green light to just carpet bomb this as much as you can.
Yeah.
And do it as much as you can, no problem. But where's the international law all of a sudden? Where's, and then they'll say, okay, wait, we want a humanitarian pause. Well, what does that mean? That, okay, you're tired of just throwing those punches, take it easy, take a breather, let the people relax as well. We'll give them some food to eat, and then you can blitz them again. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
I think it boils down to a matter of holding them to account for their contradictions and breaking their own principles and sort of their promises. It's just merely highlighting that,
exposing that hypocrisy. Because there's a lot of people who don't see it, as clearly as a historian or someone who is well versed.
And I appreciate that. You know what? Actually, you can see, but what you see with the Balfour Declaration is no longer doublespeak. It's just the British's absolute contempt for those people, and that goes against the ideas of what they, put out there in terms of human rights, in terms of equality, in terms of people having a right to their land and nation and so forth. But here you can clearly see the language of the British is of a colonial power. It's operating as a colonial power in that sense, right? And this is something that needs to be exposed.
What's the difference between conquest and colonialism?
Well, colonialism is when you come with your colonies to take that country and you want to rape it for its resources for your own good. Right, so you don't see it.
Islamic conquest.
So in an Islamic conquest, we don't do that. Firstly, we see the place as part of ourselves, right? So we embrace it as part of the framework that you're part of. Whereas when the British had colonized India, the people in India did not have the same rights as people in London. They were seen as a resource. When the British were building trains, they were not building trains so that people can travel from A to B. It's because they wanted to move resources from A to B. So
I think an easy way you can discern is basically look at the results of what Islamic conquest brought to the land and what colonialism did to the land. And you can clearly see, what were the aims or the foundations of each.
Totally. So here Balfour has a conversation, and this is interesting. He goes, at a dinner at Balfour's home in 1922, Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, they sit down and they assured Wiseman that by the term Jewish national home, they always meant an eventual Jewish state. And then Lloyd George convinced the Zionist leader that for this reason, Britain would never allow representative government in Palestine, never allow it. Right. So in the end of the day, whatever promises they were making, and what's interesting is when the Balfour Declaration was made, the British did not allow the Palestinian newspapers to print it because they were concerned that people would, rebel on the streets. And in fact, they banned the printing press in Jerusalem for 2 years. And the only way the news came in is because Palestinians who were outside of Palestine because of World War I, were sending letters, right? And saying, hey, listen, this is what they're doing. It's the Balfour Declaration. Because a lot of the times, the people who are pro-Zionist and even some Muslims will say, why didn't the Arabs move when Balfour happened? Why didn't they do anything? Why did they stay silent? It's because they didn't know what was taking place. These were happening in the corridors of power, and they were not part of those conversations.
You didn't have
telegram. Hypocrisy. They were trying to hide it. They had something to hide.
That's right. Okay, this question about the selling of land, I felt was necessary. It opened up here in Turkey, and I always feel the need that the idea that the Palestinians were selling their land is just something that really needs to be challenged. There was land selling taking place between 1908 and 1917. In that period when Jewish people were coming from Europe, there were particular people who lived there who sold their land either because they were no longer living on the land, or some of them were like Christian Maronites who had migrated, who wanted to go to Lebanon. They never saw them as Zionists who were coming over to take over the country. So they had land to spare, they sold it and said, we can move on. Because the number of people that were coming over were very small. Okay, so this idea that the Palestinians had been selling land to the Zionists doesn't make sense. What we see, however, is the majority of the land that the Palestinians have lost to the Zionists have been through confiscation after the British Mandate period. Once the British Mandate period comes about, the British allow the Zionists to take whatever they want, however they want, and the Palestinians really didn't have some sort of recourse to try to deal with that. So there has to be a difference. Pre-mandate in the Ottoman period, the people on the land who had sold their land, and there was a few of them, did not see those people as Zionists who were going to take over the nation. And actually it's interesting because I think it's Dia al-Khalidi, he writes a letter to some of the Palestinian leaders at the time warning them of this practice, because he could sort of see that this is going to have dangerous consequences, because he's quite intellectually ahead of the game. And he said, hey, listen, this is a bit problematic. We need to, whoever's selling land to these people to come here, stop it, because more of them will start coming. But still, they never imagined that a Zionist state would be created until the British Mandate, it becomes a real reality, right? In this sense. And the problem is that we're also seeing an intellectual shift from Vatan Wataniya and the family and the homeland to a language of nationalism. It's now gripping the world at this moment in time. Okay. So then what happens in 1922, and the British turned to the League of Nations, which is the first time a international intergovernmental organization was created in many ways. And the British hand over this idea of Palestine to the international government. And what they say is interesting. They say certain communities, their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized. It continues by giving an international pledge to uphold the provisions of the Balfour Declaration. The clear implication of this sequence is that only one people in Palestine is to be recognized with national rights, the Jewish people. This was in contradiction to every other Middle Eastern mandated territory. So everywhere else in the Middle East, this didn't happen when the British had colonized them. It was only happening in Palestine, where Article 22 of the Convention applied to the entire population and was ultimately meant to allow for some form of independence of these countries. So it allowed some form of independence for the other countries. It wouldn't allow it for Palestinians. And in paragraph 3, it said the Jewish people, and only the Jewish people, are described as having a historical connection to the land of Palestine, right? So they're running with the Balfour idea, and they're going ahead with this. Basically, it's telling the Palestinians that you have no historical attachment to this ground. What are you talking about? So this is where this becomes...
Is this a document that's still upheld? Because it seems immensely racist. I mean, people wouldn't people, I guess nowadays, kind of view this and see this and say that, well, hold on, this needs to be removed or changed or challenged at minimum.
Well, this was the whole argument about the two-state solution, right? To challenge this sort of like premise, and this is what I'm saying, that this ideological, what you could call basis, this creed that gives the foundations to the Zionist state. This is where they're coming from. They feel that they've always been given this type of legitimacy. So why are you complaining? Like, it's basically, you know, somebody going to a shop and, you know, taking something from the shop, and the other guy going, hey, hang on a minute. And he was like, the shopkeeper allowed me to have it. But and then you say, but wait, it's not for him to give it to you. That was mine. That wasn't even an object that was for sale in the shop. I just left my pen on the table. Well, he goes, well, I can have it, so it's mine now. He sold it to me. I don't care what you say. So wait, hang on a minute, dude. I left the pen on the table. It's not for sale. You can't take that pen off me. Well, the shopkeeper sold it. What are you talking about? And this is the game. This is the constant, you know, gymnastics that's taking place.
It's like the squatters in California. Like they'll
100%.
Yeah,
right.
They'll just come, go in a house and pretend they have a lease, and even the police can't do anything.
Exactly, because why? The issue is not what the law says. The issue is, what does the authority say, and who's in authority? It's the United States of America. At this time, it's Britain. They're not interested in the legal. The technicality is just designed to help them do whatever they want. The reality is, it's the authority. So they keep saying, but he says I can have it. And then what you need to do, unfortunately for us as Muslims, we have to beg to that authority. Say, please. We have to plead with them. We have to play this game with the gymnastics. That, hey, hang on a minute, this, that. And, you know, you'll see if Piers Morgan, you know, who continuously say, condemn Hamas, condemn Hamas, condemn Hamas. Then an Israeli will come and go, yeah, that's, yeah, you're right. It's kind of sad. What's going on here? And you can see this hypocrisy. And it's a historical hypocrisy, you know, in this sense. So Article 28, no mention, once again, of the Arab people. No mention of the Palestinians and no mention of Muslims. Simply, people had the right to religious practice and their religious places. Yani Aqsa. Article 2 gave the Jewish people of the British Mandate self-governance and institutional privileges. Once again, this was not offered to the Arabs or the Palestinian people or the Muslims. Article 4, it gave Jewish agency as a quasi-governmental status, as a public body. Once again, it didn't give any of these rights to the Palestinians. Now imagine at this time that the Jewish had a minority here. They're the minority people who have been given all of these privileges over the majority people, right? It's bizarre. One of the intriguing things at this moment is, while the Jews are economically now making money in Palestine, the problem they're having is they're not having enough children to be dominant in the area, right? This is one of the issues that the Israeli one-state solution problem they're having. They know that if we have a one state and we allow Palestinians to live with us, they'll have a lot of kids. And then they're going to have a lot of rights. They don't want it. So what they're trying to do is to say, just push them out. Get them out of here. Do whatever we can and to just get these people out, right?
That's like the basis of the no right of return as well, right?
Yeah,
because
that's
we
right.
allow those 5 million to come in as well.
In a way, it's kind of in a way, it's kind of similar to the situation in the West right now, where they're not having as many kids, and because of that, they're trying to import the cream of the crop from the rest of the world. But now they're having an internal issue.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like an identity crisis, right?
Totally. And here, what's interesting about the Jews that were there at the time and the early Zionists is that because they had this population problem and that they were outnumbered by the Palestinians, World War II changed the game for them. It turned things on its head. When Nazi Germany started to emerge in the 1930s, then there was a huge influx of migration. 60,000 in 1933 Jews turned up to Palestine.
Wow.
Okay, and what we saw then is the Palestinians freaked out. They realized, okay, we've got a situation here. We need to do something. And you've got to remember, a lot of these Jews that were coming from Europe as part of the oppression that was taking place were just regular folk. But amongst them were people who were skilled, who were educated, and some were militarily trained. Okay, the Palestinians didn't have that. They didn't have that sort of agency. So this created a demographic problem in the region once again. So imagine what the Palestinians have gone through. They've gone through World War I, where the area has been devastated. A lot of their sons have gone to the war to fight on the Ottoman side. Land has been fractured. They have been migrated into other areas. apart their home. Then the British come over, the British crush them, the British subjugate them, the British ignore them. And then during World War II, you hear just large migrations of Jews coming from Europe who are signing up to the Zionist ideology, and you're not seeing an equal hand being played here. And you're thinking to yourself, how is this possible? How is this happening? And they're saying it. They're telling the world, but nobody's listening, right? In that sense. And this is why, up until today, the Palestinians feel like they're never being heard. That people are never listening to them because it's historical in that sense. So then in 1936, Palestinian Arabs launched a revolt against the British as an occupation force, which is called the Arab Revolts, right? And it took the British 3 years, but in 1939, the British finally crushed this revolt. They had killed 2,000 Palestinians. 9,000 were put into concentration camps, and 200 of the elite thinkers were exiled out of the country. And this is a strategy that even the Israelis use today, which is to make sure that the thinkers, the Palestinian thinkers, are exiled out of the country so that they can't be considered as being people of civilization.
And what about the neighboring Muslim countries that time? Because at this point they were already divided, and they were under the different Arab kings, right? So at that time also, did they have this like, I don't want to get involved, I just want to keep my kingdom?
Not really. I mean, at that time, there was a lot of internal contestation. So Syria was going through a particular rebellion against the French occupation. There was issues going on in Iraq in terms of the British. So, in fact, what you're seeing is the British Empire is collapsing quite quickly, and the peoples in the region are rebelling against the various occupations that are there. You know, a lot of the violence that we see today, whether it's the violence of Bashar al-Assad or the violence in Egypt or in Palestine, it's colonial violence, actually.
Yes.
It's the leaders have learned colonial mechanisms because they came from an environment of the colonial world. This doesn't reflect anything Ottoman, by the way. And they are implementing that colonial violence on their own people, right? They
see put in the DNA there, basically.
Totally, absolutely. Especially within the military personnel, right? You see it consistently.
And it's not just the Arab world. You can see it, I guess, in
India,
a lot of post-colonial
That's right.
states.
That's right. That's right.
And in a way, like these countries are still like kind of colonies of the British, like in a way.
Yeah, of course.
Over. Yeah,
of course. You know, they're just outposts and resources, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
In 1944,
the idea of neo-colonialism, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like we have this. There was this whole movement regarding decoloniality, which is this idea that even if we don't live in a physically colonized world, we still live in an environment of coloniality, which means it's still there. The remnants are still there, you know. And it's hilarious because all these decolonial thinkers now have just disappeared. Now that Palestine is being blitzed, all of a sudden, you know, they don't want to be silenced. So in 1944, Zionist armed groups declared war on Britain. So during World War I, the British are, you know, their resources are being stretched here, and the Zionists take it upon themselves, unhappy with the British, especially recognizing that a lot of Jews are being killed in Germany, and Britain taking an indifferent position on it, that you know, Jews should be allowed to come to Palestine in that sense. And so they declare an armed struggle against the British. And on November 29, 1947, Britain, unable to deal with this disaster, then hands it over to the United Nations. And the United Nations tried to propose a resolution of two states. But here's the issue. They said the Jews, who are 1/3 of the population, would be given 55% of the land and would be given the most fertile areas of the space. And the Palestinians would be given like the worst parts of it, right? And obviously the Palestinians were not going to accept that. And then war broke out between the Arabs and the Zionists. And then on May 15, 1948, Britain declared the end of its occupation. What's interesting though, 8 hours before, Ben Gurion had already declared the Zionist state from Tel Aviv, prior to the British saying that they were not interested. And this day became known as the Nakba. Why? I'll come back to Churchill in a second, right? On the 10th of March, and this is where Ilan Pappé's work is great. If you get the opportunity to read The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé, it's very detailed about the whole idea of Nakba, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. He's one of the more outspoken Jewish academics who writes about this issue. And he says that on the 10th of March, 1948, a group of 11 men veteran Zionist leaders and young military soldiers, officers, went on a campaign of ethnic cleansing. No, the paramilitary unit was known as the Haganah, and they were created, in the British Mandate period, and the British had trained them and so on. And they waited. Their strategy was, this is the funny part. Their strategy was to make the argument that retaliation was necessary. So we were attacked first, is the argument. And then as a result of that, we have the right to retaliate. And as a result of that, we have the right to ethnically cleanse. Right? Does it sound familiar? It's exactly what they do, which is the idea is that,
the blueprint has changed.
Right, exactly. Which is, we've got the boot on your neck. You decided to move. Why did you move? Now I have the right to kill you. Right? And not only do I have the right to kill you, I have the right to wipe you all out. And that's exactly it. So when they keep telling us about October the 7th, you keep reminding people the boot was on the neck of Gaza. What are you talking about? Are you surprised that they wanted to break free from that? And as a result of trying to break free, you are now saying you should never have done that. Why did you do that? You know what? We're now going to indiscriminately blitz you to try to put you back into your box so that you know your role, you know your place, and you never do that again, right? And what they did was, at the time, they bombed homes, they set them alight, and then they put mines on them so that people can't return. Nothing's changed. They said now they're doing it with F-16s. Now they're doing it with American bombs. Now they're doing it with phosphorus gases. They bomb bakeries. They're bombing the fishing ports. They're bombing schools, hospitals. Why? Because after they're done with the Gaza operation, they know they have two options. Either the people leave, or if they stay, they've got nothing. They've got nothing. So why are you going to be there, right? So this is their strategy. And this is a strategy that is entrenched in the history. And Ben-Gurion, when he was asked about this strategy, he said he did not find this immoral. He did not find this immoral, right? And when Churchill was asked, he said, I do not admit that the dog in the manger, he called them dogs, the Palestinians, in the manger has the final right to the manger. He counted, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. He denied that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians or America or the black people of Australia by their replacement with a higher grade race. A higher grade race. So what he's saying basically is the Palestinians are the dog in the manger, but just because they've been there doesn't mean they have a right to that land. And when he spoke in this way, it's intriguing. It shows very clearly, because Churchill also wiped out so many Muslims in Bangladesh, very clearly how they saw themselves and the rest of the world, right? In that sense. And then Churchill in 1949.
His statement here is ironic because it applies to the Jews as well, in a sense, right?
Yeah, of course. And you know why this is intriguing? Because that's exactly how they saw the Jews in Europe. That's exactly, and the idea that Hitler was the only psychopath in Europe who wanted to eliminate the Jews is not true. The other European states also had contempt towards the Jews in Europe. And this is historically documented. This is, when you're reading Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, he creates this character called Shylock, and Shakespeare is writing from the perspective of the prejudice, the European prejudice towards the Jew. This is entrenched in them. We don't see these type of works from our culture once again. In January 1949, speaking to the British Parliament, Churchill dismissed the victims of Zionist ethnic cleansing as Arabs who came to Palestine during the period of the 25 years of the British administration and who were getting employment under the conditions we created. So his argument is, you weren't there before. You came there when we, the British, came. We gave you jobs, but you don't deserve to be here now that it's a Zionist state, right? In this sense. And this is the last point. So Ilan Pape, he claims then that this culture is an inevitable product of the Zionist ideological impulse to home its presence in Palestine, right? And this is the crux of the matter here. When we're talking about an apartheid state, when we're talking about the fact that they're a genocidal state and ethnically cleansing, it's in the framework from the foundations of the Zionist project. And so the Zionist project as an intellectual idea needs dismantling, really. Now, what I can say is this type of violence is hard to maintain.
Yeah, I think that's a point that people need to really wake up to, that this isn't about Hamas.
Right.
and October the 7th, even particularly.
Right.
This has been in the plans or in the books right from the inception.
Right. Totally.
What happened on October the 7th could have been a sort of just a push that they're using, but the idea isn't about wiping out Hamas, but like you mentioned in the previous 1-2 slides, that there's a clear policy to wipe out Gaza, to ethnically cleanse the population and leave them nothing to come back to. Right. So either they stay where they are and build a new life from scratch, or they come back to this military concentration camp and try to build a life from scratch.
Totally.
To give those like two bleak options to the Palestinians or the Gazans.
And look at the arguments they make. They will say, well, why are they not going to Egypt? Why are they not leaving? What are you talking about? Those are the same arguments the Nazis made. And then they make an argument, well, why are the fellow Arab states not taking them? That was the same arguments the Nazis made. Then why is Britain not taking them? Why is Russia not taking them? And this sounds bizarre, but what we see then, what's interesting, is the current movement towards the right that certain segments of the sort of Israeli political class have taken are replicating a particular language, which the irony is that they had suffered from. Had suffered from, right? This is the thing. And so this is what needs to be called out.
And that argument, I think, it just kind of falls flat on its face, that the fact that you can go into a country and then say, why aren't the natives moving somewhere? If I go into another Arab country like Jordan and say, like, why don't they just move over to I go into Yemen and why don't they just move over into Saudi and give me the land?
The thing that people don't realize, they'll say things like, well, Gaza had the opportunity to be the Singapore of the region. Listen, listen. They blocked the water. They block the electricity. They don't let people leave. They don't allow bread to come in. They don't allow any movement. What are you talking about? And now you're destroying everything. Like, how does this make sense? It's an occupation. And this is the United Nations recognize this as an occupation. The United Nations recognizes, and international human rights lawyers recognize this as an apartheid state. They recognize that the settlements are illegal, yet they're still doing it. And one of the problems of this current war right now is that Israelis are not ignoring international law. With the Democrats, what they're doing is they're changing international law. What they're saying is that we have the right to do this. And it's a dangerous precedent because other powerful states will follow suit. India will do it in Kashmir. China will do it in Taiwan and to the Uyghurs, because they'll see that, oh, hang on a minute, there's a framework here that we can do. And this is why, in this sense, the Zionist state is internationally dangerous.
Russia's doing it in Ukraine too. Russians say those two, like the two regions there, are actually Russian. And it's practically the same arguments, but there's sort of a hypocrisy that we've been pointing out here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I had one question. It just slipped my mind. It was SubhanAllah, I was just holding on to it for like 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, bro.
No, it's okay. It's right there. But anyway, maybe one other question. Let's say somebody says that okay, if you consider this so bad, if you consider this kind of thing so bad, what the people of Israel have done, then why do you live in America, right? Because the same thing was done to the Native Americans. So, you should be the first one to pack up and go somewhere else because you're living on stolen land. Then how would you, I guess, respond to that?
Well, for me, I don't live in the United States of America, so I don't have to answer that question, to be honest with you.
Would that
I'll give you an example. Somebody said
something you view as hypocrisy. Because that's like hundreds of people removed, and at a certain point, it's like there's not even a claim anymore. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something that I need to think about. Like, I'll give you an example. I was spoken to a few days ago, and a Muslim said to me, I don't understand why Muslims live in the West. I said, why? And he said, their taxation is paying for the bombing of Gaza. Because how do you square that off?
Yeah.
And I just looked, and I looked at his face. I said, I don't know how to square that off. He goes, every single vote that you give to those leaders, they're bombing Gaza. It doesn't matter you vote this guy or that guy, they're bombing Gaza. All the tax that you're paying, they're bombing Gaza. Like, why are you still there? And I didn't know what to say to him. I just looked
I
at his
guess the
face.
only, I guess, subscription could add to that sort of is that there is still the sense of the voice of the people, and you being the people, you have this option or you have this space in order to make that change. As long as you can muster up the influence and cause that change. And to
I think that,
before.
And also one other thing is that the way Muslims came to the West, it's because their countries were dominated and subjugated. This vacuum was created where they're like sucked up into the West, the cream of the crop, right? So it's not the same situation. Like those people, a lot of them or a lot of us, they don't have a place to go back to. You get what I'm saying?
Well, look, the thing is I think it is different, just simply because of the fact that the voices that do exist there also are a voice of resistance. Like the current situation in Palestine is an example of that. And if you speak to the people of Palestine, they're not telling you to leave the West. They understand that they require your voices to be there in that sense, you know. But what we're saying is that nobody is coming over to the United States of America and acting like a settler and a colonizer. That's not what we're doing here. That's not the intention.
And I think another way to look at it, like, say, for example, we were living during times where America was wiping out Red Indians. We would have a moral responsibility to speak up against that as well, just like we're doing for Palestine right now.
I mean, if the Native Americans were being denied, in fact, what you see is that the Native Americans in the United States of America and in Australia and in New Zealand are turning out for the Palestinians because they understand. Right? And that is a voice that I think, and I always say this to Muslims, that Muslims who live in those lands, that they should have a better relationship with the native indigenous peoples. Okay, that those indigenous peoples have a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, and in fact, Islam is a way of helping them, and that we should speak to them.
So I remembered my question, and a lot of people they give this narrative that, you know, Israel is so strong, and they have an iron grip on the Western countries, Britain and America, and like America is not able to do anything, like they have to obey Israel. And they make it sound like, you know, they're just like slaves of Israel, right? Or for example, they'll say, and this is something I've thought of as well, like, okay, Muslims, they need a lobby like Israel has, for example. But the reality seems to me more that they obviously the like you already mentioned, right? The West, they have a vested interest in this.
100%.
So they want, it's not that in a way they're the ones who are captaining the ship. It's
of course.
So
like if you look at Blinken. Sorry, go on. Your question. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to finish this part. Like, who's captaining the ship? Is it Israel or is it the West? And also, basically, you know, who's captaining the ship and who's using who?
Well, I think that it's a relationship of convenience.
Symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, and it serves both interests really well. I mean, when Blinken is coming over to Israel, you know, so he's basically saying, all right, look, and when Biden is coming over, he's saying, all right, look, I'm going to give you a bit of time so you can do what you want. And then after that, if you don't achieve your objectives, you need to stop. So here it does show you that who has the power. The power is the United States of America, where it's given them a sense of freedom, but it's also there's some restrictions on that freedom, which is what? All right, you're going to do this. Once you've achieved your rage and you've achieved that, then you stop. Then we have to go back to normal because I have elections next year. Okay? All right.
Yeah, once it starts affecting me negatively, then
that's right.
We're going to have to rediscuss our agreement here.
If it was the other way around, then the Americans would have just stayed silent. They would not have tried to play this charade. They would have just been squeezed in that context. What the Israelis have been successful at, though, is that, and this is something that I think will be harder for Muslims to do because we have a different sort of like ethical framework, right? So, for example, we don't have the notion that you can be a secular Muslim. We don't have a notion that, you know, if you don't adhere to the principles of Islam, you're still not within the fold and can do whatever you want, right? You can't have a Muslim be in charge of YouPorn or whatever those things are. Like they have these particular frameworks in this sense. And so what they've done is their framework is a lot looser than the framework that Islam has created, where it's permitted them to go into particular spaces in the capitalist framework and then be able to create networks and negotiations with particular institutions, organizations, and governments, where our framework is a little bit different from that. It has a different type of expectation. And as a result, we're not going to be able to maybe replicate some of the things that they've done. But what Allah Ta'ala tells us is what? Have trust in Allah have trust in the Deen of Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger, and have trust in the community. That we can do. That we can do, which they do not have. Which they do not have in that sense, And I think this is what we need to instill in the Muslims, which is that, you believe in Allah, you need to now trust Him. You need to trust Him in the way that the Palestinians are trusting Him. There's not a single Palestinian that I've heard. Well, I always tell my students that after Ta'if, when Rasul Sallam went through the difficulty in Ta'if, he never said to Allah Ta'ala, why are you doing this to me? That's not what he said. He said, what can I do to make it better? How can I keep going? Yani? And when we listen to the Palestinians, they're not saying, why is Allah Ta'ala doing this to me? I see that fragility, unfortunately, in my brothers and sisters in the West. But in Palestine, they just say, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, Allahu Akbar, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. They're continuously going closer to Allah Ta'ala. So in that sense, this should teach us something, that we need to get closer to Allah Ta'ala. We need to strengthen our iman. We need to work hard. We need to turn to the Quran. I don't think we're turning to the Quran enough, where all the solutions are there. Like, turn to the book and the words of Allah Ta'ala, and then trust the community, strengthen the community, make the community be airtight, work with the community so that they are not fragmented. Yani. I think this is really important, and we're providing an alternative. And I think that we should be providing an alternative to humanity. Yani. I was saying to everyone right now, this is the time to be Muslim. This is the time. This is the time to show the dunya that this is what it means to be Muslim. The Palestinians are showing it, and we're going to show it too, that this is what it means to be Muslim. We are upright, we are fair, we are good, we are kind, we do not discriminate, we're not interested in killing people and so forth. This is what Islam is. This is an opportunity, yani, in the madness, unfortunately, in the madness. And this is why I really, alhamdulillah, Muslim, yani, alhamdulillah, in that sense.
Alhamdulillah. I think that's a beautiful lesson that you've shared with us, and I think that'll be a good place also for us to end the podcast. Are we done with the slides?
Yes, we're done.
Okay, we're done
with
with the slides.
I think maybe we can give Dr. Yakub some closing remarks if he has any suggestions for the Muslims, or any like solution long term based on history, precedent, anything you have as a last message.
So I'm going to make 3 small points. The first point is that nothing lasts forever. The Ottoman Empire was around for 600 years, it disappeared. The Crusaders had a cross on Aqsa for 88 years, it disappeared. So in this idea that nothing is a rational principle, and it's a Quranic principle, that nothing is around forever. In that sense, do not lose hope, do not have despair that this world that we're living in the way that it is always going to be like that. We want to be the agents of change. And so we are not interested in progress. We are people of process. We keep working, we keep moving, and then victory comes from Allah Ta'ala. So one, do not lose hope. Do not have despair. Allah Ta'ala has chosen you to be an agent right now. Keep working. One. The second thing is, I want more and more Muslims to study their deen, to study history, and to study politics. Those 3 things are important. We need to be aware of what's happening in the dunya. We need to be aware of what happened in our past, and we need to be aware of the foundations of who we are as Muslims. These are important. And the last point is, I say this to all my students, I'm like a parrot here, but to be a student of knowledge, you require 4 things. The first is that you have to be sincere. But sincere to who? To Allah Ta'ala. If you're not sincere to Allah Ta'ala, then there's no point you being around. The second thing is you have to have knowledge. But a person of knowledge, they do not have knowledge if the knowledge is not from a sincere place, if it's not sincere. And sincere to who? To Allah Ta'ala. So your knowledge, if it's not sincere to Allah Ta'ala, then it's just information. It means nothing. And if you're going to be knowledgeable and you're going to be sincere to the work of Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger, then you're going to have to speak haqq. You're going to have to speak the truth. This is the point of learning knowledge, to proclaim the truth, to give the truth, to invite people to the truth. And if you're going to do that, then the last point is, you're going to have to be brave. You're going to have to be brave. And I'm not asking people to be stupid. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying be brave, right? So these are the 3 points that I wanted to give away, inshallah. And may Allah Ta'ala improve our situation as the Ummah. I honestly believe that something is changing. And we have to energize this Ummah. That, okay, from now on, we're not going back to the way we were before. Because if we go back to the way that we were before, it's not the fault of the Ummah. It's our fault. We failed as people who are in positions who can educate the Ummah. And they look to us and turn to us. So this is what I would say.
Wow, that's a beautiful, holistic message.
Yeah, that's an apt message from an educator. To study and study sincerely and to be courageous.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned that nothing lasts forever. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. That this is how the cycle of time turns.
That's right.
Some people are given time and they're tested by Allah Ta'ala how they're going to use the authority they were given.
Yeah.
And just to connect it with your previous point and then close, inshallah, the podcast, to trust in Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Just the first few ayat of Surah Ahzab, the first three, is something that we were doing tafsir of this last week. And in the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nabi ittaqillah. Ya ayyuhan nabi ittaqillah wa la tut'il kafirin wal munafiqin. So taqwa, fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Wa tawakkal ala Allah wa kafa billahi wakila. The trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is enough for you as a protector. And ma ja'ala Allahu li rajulin min qalbayni fi jawfi, which the Mufassirun have said that Allah Ta'ala hasn't given us two hearts, where one we can have trust in Allah, and then the other one we can hold, trust in other things. Or no, your heart has to be completely taken by trust in Allah, taqwa of Allah, fear of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and hope. Our heart should be for Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. We only have this one heart, and other examples are given in the same verse of things we only have one of, like one mother, we only have one father. So this is a message I think that the Muslims should keep in mind, that we trust only in Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and we take that lesson from the Palestinians, especially, and really from the Palestinian children, as I made the mention during the podcast. But I want to say Jazakallahu khairan.
Barakallahu feek. Thank you for having me.
Inshallah, we'll love to have you again and again, inshallah.
Inshallah.
For this beautiful presentation, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept everything you've shared with us and with the community. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it fruitful and worthwhile, and hopefully it opens up people's hearts and minds. And inshallah, we'll leave it there. We ask everyone to like, subscribe, inshallah, comment as well, and be active. Take whatever, a lot of times people give a lot of, I guess, mashura to us, advices. But the biggest advice is that we should practice on all the advices we were given during our life. We've heard these over and over. So we leave everybody with the advice to practice upon the advices that are given. There is a lot of khair in it. These are taken from the Quran and the Sunnah, especially. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward everyone. Thank you, everyone, for giving us your time. And especially our guest, Dr. Yakub, inshallah. Until next time. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.